Between March and July of 1943, the artillery that had thundered across the Russian heartland for 2 years suddenly fell silent. The opposing Soviet and German forces found themselves in a rare state of uneasy peace. But everyone knew this calm was an illusion. A storm of fire and steel was about to break. Although the Germans had lost their entire 6th Army, 330,000 elite troops, at Stalingrad in the battles of the previous summer and fall, it was still too soon for many, especially senior German commanders like Erich von Manstein, to see that the war had reached its turning point. In their view, the defeat at Stalingrad was a tragedy caused by a series of accidents: the brutal winter, the vicious street fighting, and Hitler's own foolishness. They believed Germany's panzer tactics were still invincible. If they could just fight on their own terms and play to their strengths, the Wehrmacht would once again be the unstoppable mechanized legion of 1941-1942. The Battle of Kharkov, which erupted from February to March of that year, only reinforced this confidence. Under Manstein's command, the Germans seized a tactical opportunity and launched a brilliant counterattack against an overconfident and overextended Red Army, not only retaking Kharkov but nearly encircling the Soviet forces under Nikolai Vatutin. On the other hand, the defeat at Kharkov was a splash of cold water for the Soviet High Command Stavka, snapping them out of their post-Stalingrad blind optimism and reminding them of what a fearsome power they still faced. The Russian spring mud temporarily halted any further military operations, forcing the two armies into a stalemate along a bulging front line running from Orel through Kursk to Kharkov and Belgorod. At the top of this massive bulge, Germany's Army Group Center was entrenched at Orel. The central part of the salient around Kursk was held by the Red Army Central and Voronezh fronts. To the south, in Belgorod, was Manstein's Army Group South. Along this Kursk salient, the two sides eyed each other warily, creating an unnatural quiet on the shell-torn Eastern Front. But behind this calm, both armies were maneuvering troops and building up their forces non-stop. Here, the Germans wanted to prove their blitzkrieg could still crush any enemy. Here, the Soviets wanted to prove that their theory of deep battle was the king of armored warfare doctrines. Here, on the plains of Kursk, there would be no winter, no street fighting, and no more excuses, only tanks, steel, and artillery. Here, like two evenly matched behemoths of steel, the Soviets and Germans would throw everything they had into a life-and-death struggle that would go down in military history. For Manstein, the victory at Kharkov not only wiped away his frustration over failing to rescue the 6th Army the previous winter, but also restored his faith in Germany's blitzkrieg tactics. As early as March, while the Battle of Kharkov was still raging, he began planning a much larger operation for the summer, aimed at annihilating the maximum number of Soviet forces and regaining the strategic initiative. Bolstering his deep-seated confidence in German panzer tactics was the Wehrmacht's new equipment. During the fighting at Kharkov, many Soviet tankers discovered to their horror that the T-34's previously safe engagement distance against other German tanks had become a kill zone in the face of the new German Tiger tank. Moreover, German medium tanks and self-propelled guns, now widely refitted with 75mm cannons, completely outclassed Soviet tanks. The German Grossdeutschland division claimed to have destroyed 269 Soviet tanks, including 229 T-34s, between March 7th and 20th alone. Manstein's confidence was also fueled by the expansion of German strength on the Eastern Front. Despite heavy personnel losses in the 1942-1943 campaign, German forces had not diminished but had actually grown, thanks to transfers from the Western Front and the conscription of nearly 2 million new recruits from home. By July, when the Battle of Kursk began, the German army on the Eastern Front numbered 196 divisions, with a total field strength of 3.345 million men, one of the peak strengths for German forces on the entire Soviet-German front. At the same time, German armored equipment received significant updates and reinforcements. Between March and the end of June 1943, Germany sent 1,607 tanks and self-propelled guns to the Eastern Front. By the eve of the Battle of Kursk, the total number of German tanks and self-propelled guns on the front reached 3,434. For comparison, the total number of tanks and self-propelled guns mobilized for Operation Barbarossa was around 3,700. After 2 years of bloody and brutal warfare, the number of German armored vehicles on the Eastern Front had slightly decreased, but their quality had improved dramatically. The Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were now commonly equipped with more powerful 75mm cannons, capable of penetrating the front armor of Soviet T-34 and KV tanks at 500 meters or more. The latest Panzer IV H model also saw a leap in protection, with its front hull upgraded to a single 80mm plate of armor and armored skirts added to the turret and sides. At this point, Germany's workhorse medium tanks had begun to decisively overwhelm their Soviet counterparts in performance. However, beyond the upgraded medium tanks, what gave the Germans even greater confidence was their new, invincible trump card, the heavy tank. After inspecting a Tiger tank battalion, Hitler once boasted that a single battalion of Tigers was worth an entire old-style Panzer division. This was no empty claim. A German Tiger battalion consisted of a headquarters unit with 3 Tigers and 3 tank companies with 45 Tigers, totaling 1,093 personnel. It was supported by 6 anti-aircraft armored vehicles, 10 armored cars, 8 tank recovery vehicles, 8 tank repair vehicles, 17 four-wheeled maintenance vehicles, 25 four-wheeled command cars, 2 civilian cars, 64 jeeps, and 111 transport vehicles. Such a powerful force was truly intimidating. For the Red Army defenders at Kursk, while they couldn't have known the exact composition of a Tiger battalion, they had already picked up on ominous signs from the earlier Battle of Kharkov. In the early stages of the war, Soviet armor was not at a disadvantage. The T-34's 60-degree sloped armor, in particular, caused small-caliber shells to ricochet, and the KV-1, with its 100mm of frontal armor, had given German tanks a hard time. But as the war dragged on and vast territories, especially industrial centers and resource-rich regions, fell into enemy hands, the quality of Soviet tank armor began to noticeably decline. The Germans also discovered a weakness in the T-34. Its main gun had poor depression, forcing it to expose its underbelly when cresting hills. They began to widely employ tactics of firing down from ridgelines, nullifying the advantage of the T-34's sloped armor. By the eve of the Battle of Kursk, Soviet tanks were technically outmatched. Facing Germany's clear technological superiority, the Soviet leadership from Stavka down to the 2 fronts defending Kursk realized that an offensive was out of the question. The only viable option was a defensive strategy. Use their numerical superiority to create a massive defense in depth, continuously bleeding the German armored offensive until its strength was exhausted, then commit reserves for a counterattack. In theory, this was no different from the strategic thinking at Stalingrad, but there was one problem. This time, there was no fortress city to anchor their defense. They would have to face Germany's armored spearhead head-on in the open field. Before the battle erupted, the Soviets had deployed 2 full fronts in the salient, with an additional 570,000 men from the steppe military district held as a strategic reserve. They had also constructed massive defensive fortifications. Although the Soviets surpassed the Germans in total troop numbers and equipment, they faced a German qualitative advantage in heavy weaponry, experience, and training. The Soviet high command had no real confidence that their quantity could overcome Germany's quality. In Manstein's mind, Operation Citadel should have been launched the moment the spring mud dried up to achieve the element of surprise that Blitzkrieg demanded. In his post-war memoirs, he insisted that Hitler's hesitation and delays gave the Soviets too much time to build their formidable defensive lines, ultimately causing the operation to fail. Yet Hitler could hardly be blamed. The trump cards he was banking on the Tiger and other heavy tanks were being produced far too slowly, at an average of just 1 per day, making it impossible to meet the front line's needs for a major offensive. The Germans were caught in a dilemma. To assemble a sufficiently powerful strike force, they had to spend precious time waiting, but to strike before the Soviets could react, they would have to go without their most powerful heavy tanks. Ultimately, Manstein, a brilliant armored commander, was only looking at the problem from a tactical perspective. He failed to see that the Blitzkrieg tactics he was so proud of were underpinned by the full industrial might of his nation. By 1943, after 2 years of bloody war, Nazi Germany's national power was severely depleted and could no longer compare to its peak, while its opponent, the Soviet Union, was a far cry from the Poland and France of years past. At this point, Germany's industrial capacity was no longer sufficient to execute a perfect blitzkrieg against the Soviets, a fact made clear by its inability to achieve both strategic surprise and tactical striking power in Operation Citadel. It wasn't until the end of June that German forces were fully assembled at Kursk. Their armored units represented roughly 75% of all panzer forces available on the entire Eastern Front. After the battle began, another company of Tigers and a panzer division would join the fight. For Operation Citadel, the German attack was split into two prongs. The northern pincer was led by Walter Model's 9th and 2nd Armies, with a strike force of 753 tanks and self-propelled guns, including 31 Tigers, 89 Ferdinands, and 45 Brumbers. The southern pincer, the main effort, was commanded by Manstein and consisted of the 4th Panzer Army, Army Detachment Kempf, and parts of the 2nd Army, with a strike force of 1,508 tanks and self-propelled guns, including 102 Tigers and 200 Panthers. On July 4th, the Russian plains, silent for over 100 days, were rocked by the thunder of artillery. The largest tank battle in history, the Battle of Kursk, had begun. German forces stormed the Soviet defensive positions from the north and south, attempting to cut off and encircle the Red Army at Kursk. At the outset, the Germans changed their usual tactics, instead imitating a common Soviet approach. They first used combat engineers and infantry under artillery support to breach the front lines, destroy anti-tank guns, and clear minefields before committing their main armored force. This was intended to avoid unnecessary tank losses in the opening phase and allow them to penetrate deep into enemy territory with their forces intact to exploit their gains. On the northern front, across a 20-kilometer wide sector, 60,000 German troops led by 400 tanks and self-propelled guns under Model's command surged toward the Soviet positions like an armored torrent. The Tigers and Ferdinands shrugged off Soviet artillery fire but failed to quickly break through the lines. The Soviet defensive tactics proved effective. Dense anti-tank minefields halted the German advance, while artillery in the rear relentlessly shelled the trapped panzer units. German infantry, pinned down by machine gun and mortar fire, couldn't advance. After the Germans painstakingly cleared 4 paths through the minefields, they were blocked again by Soviet rapid obstacle-laying teams. These brave soldiers attacked German tanks with Molotov cocktails and grenades while laying mines right in front of their tracks. This fearless style of attack was especially threatening to the Ferdinand tank destroyers, which lacked anti-infantry machine guns. The Soviet defense in depth thwarted the German armored assault at every turn, slowing its progress to a crawl. After a full day of grueling combat and significant casualties, the northern German force had only managed to penetrate 6-8 kilometers, only to be confronted by the 2nd Soviet defensive line. While the northern pincer was bogged down in a bitter fight, Manstein's Army Group South launched its ferocious attack northward on July 5th. Dense armored formations pressed forward like a wall of steel, bearing down on the Soviet positions. Initially, the German technological advantage was on full display. They knocked out the few Soviet tanks they encountered from a distance of 2,200 meters. But then they ran into trouble at the main defensive line. Just like their comrades in the north, they advanced only 3 kilometers before getting stuck in Soviet minefields, pinned down by artillery, especially the 76mm guns. It took them 10 hours and the loss of 36 Panthers to finally break through the first Soviet line. On that day, the Germans committed over 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. At the cost of around 300 vehicles, they had merely breached the first line of defense and reached the second. The fighting on July 4th and 5th was a microcosm of the entire Battle of Kursk. While German tanks, especially the heavy ones, held overwhelming superiority over their Soviet counterparts, the multi-layered, deep defensive system the Soviets had prepared caused them immense trouble. Throughout the battle, a common pattern emerged. German forces would launch an attack led by heavy tanks, only to get bogged down in anti-tank minefields at the front of the Soviet positions. The moment they slowed down to navigate the mines, they would be pounded by intense Soviet artillery fire. There were even instances of a Ferdinand being hit directly on its hatch by a howitzer shell and blown to pieces. If German infantry or engineers tried to advance to clear a path for the tanks, they were met with withering fire from pre-sighted Soviet machine guns and mortars. This scene repeated itself endlessly throughout the Battle of Kursk. Although the Germans racked up impressive kill counts, destroying huge numbers of Soviet tanks, their own forces were being bled dry in the offensive. After advancing 10-20 kilometers, they would often have lost so many heavy tanks that they could no longer exploit their gains. Though the Soviets suffered horrific casualties, they relied on their vast, fortified defensive belts, dense minefields, and enormous strategic reserves to effectively slow the German armored assault, even without particularly effective anti-tank weapons of their own. The German attack failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives in this sense. The Soviet defense in depth had effectively broken Germany's blitzkrieg. The most famously discussed event of the Battle of Kursk is the clash at Prokhorovka on July 12th. This encounter is renowned as the largest tank engagement in history. On that day, the Soviet Fifth Guards tank army ran headlong into the 2 SS Panzer Corps and 3 Panzer Corps, which were making a surprise thrust from the south and southwest. The Soviets deployed southwest of Prokhorovka with 858 tanks and self-propelled guns, while the Germans had 816 tanks and self-propelled guns. A staggering 1,600 armored vehicles clashed here in a fight for the ages. At 8 a.m., following an artillery barrage, the Soviets sent the signal "Steel, steel, steel," and 300 of their tanks launched a furious assault along the railway line toward the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler. The Germans, leveraging the power of the Tiger's 88mm gun, began picking off Soviet tanks at 800 meters. But the Soviets pressed on, using their numerical superiority to swarm the German positions, forcing the panzers into a fighting retreat. After losing 30 tanks, the Soviets finally closed the distance and began knocking out Tigers at point-blank range. The battle then raged across the Prokhorovka area. The Germans, with their superior crew skill and firepower, inflicted heavy losses on the Soviets. But the Soviets, at the cost of immense sacrifice, charged up to the German tanks for close-range shots, steadily causing German casualties. At first, the German tankers had the upper hand, destroying Soviet tanks at long range on the open ground, but their optimism didn't last. The Soviet tanks charged forward like suicidal madmen. Even as the Germans tried to pull back to maintain distance, an endless stream of Soviet tanks kept closing in and firing. In one company alone, 5 Tigers were hit and caught fire, while other German tanks suffered varying degrees of damage. Although the Germans held a tactical advantage, the fatigue of prolonged combat and the depletion of ammunition were taking their toll. By noon, the Soviets threw in their second echelon of over 100 tanks. The Germans were now in no condition to continue the fight. With half their vehicles out of action, they were forced to withdraw. After the battle, the wreckage of tanks from both sides littered the fields of Prokhorovka. Black smoke choked the sky, and the earth was scarred with burning steel, as if the fire and iron of the entire Soviet-German war had been concentrated in this one place. In the Battle of Prokhorovka, the Soviets lost 280 tanks and self-propelled guns, while the Germans lost about 150. Despite the heavy cost, the Soviets had foiled Germany's attempt to seize Prokhorovka in a surprise attack. More critically, Germany's limited number of Tigers had been severely depleted, with little hope of replacements. The Soviet advantage in numbers was finally beginning to tell. The scales of victory had slowly begun to tip in the Soviets' favor. Shortly after Prokhorovka, the German high command lost all hope of victory at Kursk, except for Manstein, who stubbornly insisted that victory was within reach and just needed one last push. No one else saw any point in continuing the battle. Soon after, Hitler used the Allied landing in Italy as a pretext to transfer SS Panzer divisions away from the front, effectively ending Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk. The German Panzer Arm now had to face a harsh reality. Their most elite troops, their finest weapons, their most brilliant commander, and their signature armored tactics could no longer secure a victory against the Red Army, which had finally come into its own. After more than 2 years of careful instruction, from their best coach, the German Panzer Corps, the Soviet armored forces, had matured into a terrifyingly powerful adversary. Though they still had their problems, the Battle of Kursk showed the world the immense power of Soviet-style deep battle doctrine. In defense, they could stop an assault from any armored force in the world on the attack. They could drown any opponent in an iron tide. After Kursk, the German Panzer Arm began its slow decline, while the Soviet armored forces were just beginning their ascent to peak power. In the 1944 Ardennes offensive, the defeated Germans at Kursk would use many lessons learned from the Soviets to give the Western Allied armored forces a harsh education, even with critical shortages of fuel and ammunition. This indirectly showed Britain and America the terrifying power of the Soviet armored corps. As a result, throughout the Cold War, the specter of a Soviet tank horde, armed with the doctrine of deep battle, would remain NATO's greatest nightmare.